Well, Nick McPherson, welcome back. You and I have had a very productive conversation earlier this summer about coronavirus, and I would have to say you were right on everything you said, unfortunately, because you had some cautionary tales and some gloomy thoughts, but also some thoughts about how to get out of it. And your job today is to judge whether, which of the four schools has come up with the best analysis of the UK situation and the best policy prescription. So without further ado, we'd like to go through them in the order that I gave them to you. This is in no particular order. And I'd just like your thoughts on each of them. So we're going to start, if we may, with Withington Girls' School in Manchester.
Right. Withington Girls' School, I thought, gave a really good presentation. I liked their emphasis on productivity. And I also like the way they look beyond the coronavirus crisis to look at some of the longer term trends in the British economy. They made a really interesting emphasis on digital infrastructure, remote working, and education technology. And indeed, this was their main plan to get us out of the current situation. My only question there was whether focusing on digital to quite such an extent would have the necessary economic impact more broadly. With the best will in the world, there are large segments of the population who are working now in low-paid jobs who are unlikely to be able to exploit that. But equally, as I've seen in government, there's a huge merit in doing one thing really well rather than spreading yourself thinly and doing a lot of things badly. I was interested in their macroeconomic response. They were definitely at the more cautious end of the spectrum. In one sense, as a former Treasury official, that rather appealed. I did have a policy question, which was, interestingly, they proposed suspending effectively the Bank of England's independence and requesting the bank to work in tandem with the Treasury on macroeconomic strategy. That in many ways is very radical and makes a fair amount of sense. But having decided on that institutional change, their strong recommendation was not to lower interest rates any further and not to do any more quantitative easing. So you kind of wondered you lose credibility by taking away independence, but it's not even as if after doing all of that you're going to do anything particularly radical. And on the spending side, as far as I could make out, the proposal really was just to spend £1 billion more than the current Chancellor, Mr. Sunak, is proposing. Quite rightly, they wanted to spend that on the NHS, on PPE equipment, and so on. But they were also right, in my view, to look beyond the short term to consider how you keep the public finances sustainable in the longer term. I think in all my feedback, I want to look at the as well as looking at the substance. I think it's also really important to focus on the presentation, because if you were in a situation where you had 10 minutes to sell to the Prime Minister or Chancellor a plan, it's really important that you're clear. And I thought Withington's delivery was crisp, engaging. Their presentation was eye-catching. I like their use of colour. If I have one criticism of the charts, sometimes I had to think just a little bit too long about what these charts were telling me, and there was a sort of risk in places that the charts became a little disconnected from the words of the excellent presenters. But those are, I'm trying to find areas to criticise there, because I think this was a really good presentation and I much enjoyed it.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, so the second one I passed you on was the Grange School from Hertford near Northwich. I wonder if you could give us some thoughts on that one.
yes, once I discovered that Hertford were near Northwich, I felt much reassured. I felt very briefly that maybe they had somehow managed to get into competition despite being quite near London. But I knew you wouldn't do that. And actually, generally, I should make the point, I thought it was really fantastic, the focus on the Northwest. Now, the Grange School, really good analysis. I liked the way the presentation kicked off with some really good scene setting and just reminding us that growth had been slow for some time and that there were wider issues to do. I mean, wider drivers of that. General uncertainty, the financial crisis, austerity leading to a basic lack of investment. And I also liked the emphasis on trade and also on immigration, where I thought the presentation was very interesting on some of the trade-offs on these issues. There's also interesting analysis of the labour market. I liked the comparison with the United States. I liked the argument that there could actually be benefits in the United States' wider labour market flexibility. Equally, I think they probably missed something, which is that the published unemployment figures at the moment don't really reflect the full impact of the crisis because they are published with quite a long lag. And a later presentation actually dealt with this by looking at universal credit claims, which I think was good. But going back to the Grange, I liked some of the discussion on negative interest rates and on monetary policy more generally. This was the only presentation which advocated changing the inflation remit of the Bank of England to 4%, which is definitely an interesting idea. I do wonder how you would achieve 4% inflation in practice, but it definitely added to the quality of the debate. Similarly, I liked the focus on regional unemployment, on construction, and on infrastructure. As with a number of the presentations, there was a really good focus on the opportunity of green measures, things which would go with the grain in reducing climate change, and also some thoughtful ideas around helping people on low incomes who generally will have the highest marginal propensity to consume. And the presentation finished with some really interesting observations about borrowing. Again, as a former Treasury official, I like the historic analysis of how debt peaked pretty much at VE Day back in 1945, and that there were real opportunities in locking in low interest rates by borrowing over 50 years or longer. And the presentation finished with some sensible ideas around taxes, whilst also cautioning about increasing taxes too early, lest that chokes off the recovery. So I rated this presentation highly. I like the delivery. I mean, it did appear to be a one-person band. I don't know whether more people were involved in writing it, but if it were all the work of one person, it was a real tour de force, and it was evenly paced and it flowed well. I mean, there was, at risk of being pedantic, there was one misspeak or misstep where the speaker referred to an increase in the budget deficit in Q1 when actually they're referring to a chart on the balance of payments deficits in Q1. But I won't. That's easily done, but always important to check your work before submitting it. And I thought the charts were very clear and the presentation flowed.
And well, to add to your comments, it was actually one person did all the work on that, so to their great credit.
Well, I was impressed.
Okay.
Good.
Cheadle Hulme School in Stockport is the third one.
Cheadle Hulme, good historical analysis, nicely presented. As I mentioned earlier, skillful use of the universal credit claims as an indicator of the short-run performance of the labour market. There was good coverage, I thought, of monetary policy. I liked the reference that we might be in a Keynesian liquidity trap. That made a lot of sense to me. And I also like the focus on household expectations and consumer confidence and the recognition that, in the end, if you're going to get the economy going, consumption would be really quite critical. Now, the solutions were offered on a broad front, and my only thought was that perhaps the interventions were too broadly based and didn't fully reflect the analysis. So let me give you an example. The line which was taken was that the best way to stimulate growth was through further quantitative easing. But if we are in a liquidity trap, actually, is QE going to be the answer? I think the logic of Keynes's analysis was you really needed to embark on a really big public works infrastructure program. And again, I liked the emphasis on buying green companies' debt in particular. But with the best one in the world, I don't think there's a huge amount of debt with sufficiently green characteristics out there to make a huge difference. Similarly, the business support proposals, I just worried whether they would be sufficiently well targeted. So two proposals were made. One was to extend business rate relief to bigger businesses with bigger rate bills, but to try and target it through a means test. All I would say on that is good idea to try and target it, but a bit of a risk that you end up with really quite a complicated test, which is difficult to administer. So doing that efficiently and effectively is a challenge. Similarly, I wondered whether reducing the corporation tax rate, which generally I'm a fan of, don't get me wrong, would be poorly targeted. The fact is that a lot of struggling firms aren't making any profits at all, so aren't going to benefit from a corporation tax cut. And probably the firms which do pay big amounts of corporation tax are clearly profiting well from current conditions and don't really need further incentives. But I thought that the proposals had good coverage of the furlough scheme. I quite like a temporary cut in VAT, but is there a case for trying to target that by, say, targeting it at the hospitality industry? I don't know. Forward guidance raised its head. I wonder whether you needed forward guidance, given that long-term rates are so low. But it's an interesting idea, and I think the presentation ended with the proposal to increase the top rate of income tax. Perfectly sensible, but I really don't think it would raise a huge amount of revenue. But again, in criticising the policy solutions, I'm just trying to find things to criticise, because I think this is another one which was really clear. I liked the sound of the team. They paced the presentation at just the right rate, and there were some really good charts. Right. So I again rated this one highly, and I hope I am beginning to demonstrate in my comments that I'm finding it very difficult to pick a winner, because this is a high quality set of proposals.
Excellent. Well, we have a fourth high quality set of proposals from Birkenhead School. Your final one to comment on. So what do you think of that one?
Well, I enjoyed Birkenhead School proposals. I found the structure of their presentation perhaps the most compelling of the lot. But just as it had some of the it really hit the high notes, I think it's also fair to say, and I'll come back to those, there were some, the odd error in how to put together a presentation, which I will come back to. So let's focus on what I liked. I liked the clarity of first the analysis, then setting out the policy objectives, and then setting out the policy proposals, and even finishing off with a few words on the trade-offs and risks. I thought this would have made a really good bit of Treasury advice to the absolutely. Chancellor or Prime Minister. I thought also it was interesting because Birkenhead were one of the few, I think nearly any presentation, which acknowledged that there could be risks on the upside with inflation as well as on the downside. And I thought the remarks there were interesting. I also really liked the thoughts about how you come out of the coronavirus crisis and the risks of a W-shaped recovery rather than a V-shaped recovery. And I think my personal view is that a W-shaped recovery could do more damage to confidence in the long-term growth in the economy than really anything else. So I think they were right to focus on that. And I also really like the fact that they were focused on the opportunities of the coronavirus crisis. There's an old saying that you should never waste a good crisis. And they really did make the case for coming through stronger on regional and wage inequalities. Birkenhead were definitely at the expansionary end of the spectrum. They wanted to have a serious stimulus combining public investment with further quantitative easing. And I think they were right on their infrastructure plans to home in on transport, and also, like others, to see this as a catalyst for pro-environmental measures. They made the case for higher taxes on the rich. I quite liked one of the points they made there, so I'm referring to my notes. Yes, there had been this outbreak of goodwill amongst the better off. And I think that's an interesting point too, and say that they would be more prepared to pay. And since they built up savings during the crisis, it probably wouldn't affect their consumption. So I scored Birkenhead high on content. I'm afraid I scored them a lot less high on presentation. The basic problem they had is they were trying to pack too much into this presentation, with the result that the first speaker in particular had to speak very quickly in order to cover all the ground. And even when they'd spoken very quickly, actually, my recollection is that they were sort of cut off in mid-flow at the end of the presentation. So it ends in mid-sentence. And related to that, I commented that the charts were really good, but there weren't very many of them. And the charts were done with about 40% of the way through the spoken narrative. And that too, I think, is a mistake. Pictures, as they say, are worth 1,000 words, or is it 100 words? I don't know. Anyway, I think they missed a trick there. So, as I say, some of the best thinking went on in this presentation, but also some of the worst techniques for presenting, and but I don't want to depress them on the presentation front. It's just a bit of advice for the future.
Okay.
Because this was a serious bit of work.
Right, some potential Treasury officials in the mix there somewhere. Right, now, Nico, I've explained to you that I'd like to do this in 2 takes. So we're going to take a brief cup-up break and then come back for the results in a moment, which I have to say I don't know yet. So I'm as excited as anyone watching.